Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all on this slightly grey late October afternoon to this webinar on how to write job descriptions. So my name's Bart and I'm going to be your host today, and the webinar that you're about to participate in is provided by FJ Wilson Talent Services, who are a talent acquisition and development service. The guidance that you're about to hear today is based on FJ Wilson's experience of recruiting for mid to senior level professional roles. So with us today to guide us through the topic of authoring job descriptions is Fiona Wilson, who is Managing Director of FJ Wilson, and Anthony Haynes, who is the Communications Director of FJ Wilson. So welcome Fiona and welcome Anthony.
Hello
Thanks,
everyone.
Bart.
It's great to have you both with us today, and thank you very much for making time for this. It's also great to have the audience with us today. Thank you very much for coming along. So a little bit of information for you as to how this webinar is going to work. During this webinar, we're going to provide 3 sets of suggestions for how to write job descriptions. After each of these sets of suggestions, there's going to be plenty of time for live question and answers with Fiona and Anthony. So please, as questions do occur to you, please do drop them in the chat, which you can find on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Now, this chat is moderated, so any questions that you ask are just blind to the person who asks it and the moderator, who happens to be myself. And then when I read out your question to Fiona and Anthony, I'm not going to mention any names. If we get a lot of questions, then we're going to have to perform a little bit of triage. So please don't be offended if we don't get around to answering your question. It's always good to have lots and lots of questions to answer, but if we get too many, then we're going to have to just trim things down for the sake of running to time. So without further ado, let's move on to the first topic. And the first topic is all around what is the first problem area with job descriptions?
The current role. When it comes to writing a job description, one of the key challenges is that people writing it analyse the current role, think of all the components and then work out what attributes are required for that, and then collate all of those into one, sometimes massive list. So there are 2 problems with that approach. One is that often the attributes then become a completely unrealistic number. We've seen in excess of 20 on many job descriptions over the years and still do. And the second problem is that that approach actually subverts objectivity. So if nobody meets all the requirements, then you have no choice but to fall back on subjectivity. By writing a huge list, it can really overwhelm potential applicants when they actually see the job description. And indeed, it can absolutely discourage qualified candidates from applying. And that unintentionally can discourage candidates from diverse backgrounds applying as well. So our key message here is to focus on the essentials, identify the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves, and if at all possible, provide some context for the must-haves. One of the things that often isn't included on job descriptions is the provision of training opportunities for certain skills and attributes that are not strictly required and could be learned.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that. Hang on a second. Let me just reactivate my camera. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for those sets of suggestions. And I think that's a very good introduction to the topic. So thank you to our audience for asking some questions as well. The first question that I'd like to put to you, Fiona, and to Anthony, is that surely analysing the job components and collating a list together is the logical thing to do. Otherwise, how else do you communicate the variety and the depth of what the role might entail?
I think that's like an absolutely fair point, and it's perhaps similar to the process that an individual could go through when producing a CV. There's nothing wrong at all with having ultimately like a master document where the first part of that process is actually to brainstorm and write down absolutely sort of everything. But what we're talking about here is almost a distillation process where, as an author, you need to arrive at the most pertinent areas. Perhaps we would advise around sort of 5 or so. So again, that you're not discouraging a potential audience by having this vastly unrealistic list of sometimes sort of 20 plus essential requirements.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and I agree with Fiona. I mean, when she says sometimes 20 plus, I mean, you do sometimes see something like 40.
Yep.
I think
Wow.
the question was, is it logical? And in a way, yes, I think it's logical. But if you consider each point in isolation, each component of the job in isolation, you might think, well, that's a part of the job, so it should go in the job description. But you can't. When you're conducting a selection process, you're not considering the points in isolation. You're trying to make an overall judgment. And when the candidates are applying and preparing themselves, again, there's an overall requirement there. So you have to not only consider each point in isolation, but also what's the overall loading. Overall, have we swamped everything or not? One question that'd be helpful is each time you want to put something in, you have to ask, is it decisive? Like, if they haven't actually got that, say you got a great candidate, they haven't actually got that component, they can't convince you they can do that component. I mean, is that the end of their application or not? And if it isn't, that suggests that might be a candidate for deleting. I just mentioned one special case, which is a historic case, which is often the person who is leaving the office has been there for, let's say, a few years, and they gradually accumulate tasks. Maybe I'll give you an example. I used to work for a publishing company, and I became the public speaker for that company. But it wasn't integral to the job, which my job was to edit books. It was just that I quite liked doing it and no one else wanted to do it. Now, the problem is that as these things, you get this accretion of things, and then there's a sort of assumption of, well, the person who does that job does that thing. So they sort of stay there forever, whether or not it's integral to the job and whether the next person is suitable to it. So I think it's really important to make a distinction between, well, what are the things that are integral to that job and what are the ones that have just been sort of packaged together for circumstantial reasons.
Interesting. So another question that really segues nicely into actually is, well, would one way of solving this would be to maybe divide the job description into components that are essential and components that are maybe just desirable? Would that be a solution in your mind, or is that just sort of a halfway house?
I mean, I think again the first point here is that our view is that a job description or a JD shouldn't be an encyclopedia, to Anthony's sort of point of all of the tasks of what you want the role ideally to be, or indeed what the role has been under the incumbent. It's quite neat to and quite common to distinguish between essential and desirable. The challenge, however, if you list desirable, is that some candidates may look at those and be put off again from actually pursuing an application, because their view will be, if they don't have those, they may lack the sort of competitive edge in the process. So personally, we may have sort of different views in the scenarios. We would recommend that people really stick to that sort of essential narrative on which the whole recruitment process is going to be based.
Yeah, you could, for example, to follow on from Fiona's point, you could set the desirable ones out not as bullet points, because the minute you put them out as bullet points, you kind of feel like you have to tick each one off. But just in a paragraph, like, in addition, the following might be, would also be welcome, that kind of language. What I would say is, I think the task of the employer going through it and analysing them into essential and desirable is a good one. However, people don't go far enough. So I mentioned earlier that sometimes we see 40 bullet points. So I vividly remember a job for a scientific job. There were 40 attributes, and the employer had gone through sorting them into essential and desirable. And guess what? There were 36 essential and 4 desirable. Well, that doesn't really help anyone. And also, I don't believe it. Like, I don't actually believe these 36 are really essential. So, I mean, I think it is a good exercise for the employer to think, well, what are we really not going to compromise on? But I think what happens nearly every time is that they don't go far enough, and they're sort of reluctant to let go of things. One of the causes of that is there's often a bit of a committee mentality. That several people are involved in sorting the essentials and desirables, and of course each person has their own particular hobby horses. that they want to get onto the essential list, and it's probably better if there's one person who is probably the line manager who's just going to be decisive about these things.
It's interesting hearing you say that, because when I'm hearing what you're saying about the desirable attribute and what you said earlier about, well, maybe there are things that could be offered for a candidate in terms of training. Is there a link between those two? Could some of the desirables actually be phrased as training and development opportunities to avoid that anxiety on the part of the candidate in the first place? That if they haven't got it, they won't have a competitive edge, and is it worth them going for it in the first place?
Yes, I always feel when people put down this kind of huge number of essentials, the implication is they're not going to be learnt on the job at all. You have to come in fully formed. Now, the questions to ask her is, well, what about the other people who are already out of the business? Did they come in fully formed with all of it? I bet they didn't. I don't think I've ever gone into a job with all of the attributes fully in place. You also have to ask yourself, what does that say about your staff development? But there's nothing you can do to help these people once they're there. I would just pick on one thing. I think people often talk of training, and that's fine, but training tends to bring in mind people enrolling on courses or actually going out on training courses and so on, which can be expensive and actually not always terribly effective. I mean, it can be sometimes. So it's worth thinking about staff development rather than simply training. So some staff development is just experiential, like you just do it and get better. There are also things like mentoring, and mentoring is much more popular today than it used to be, and my experience, I mean, look, I have a vested interest because I do a lot of my paid income is from mentoring, so of course I'm going to say this, aren't I do actually think mentoring can be really effective. And it's not free of charge, because nothing's free. I mean, you're always paying for staff time, but often it doesn't have the sort of same fee structure involved.
Interesting.
One of the most interesting examples of a JD that we've seen with one of the chartered professional bodies is just on 2 pages, but the first page divides it between sort of year 1 of the role, year 2 of the role, and thereafter, and it just clearly lists out sort of the expectations of where the post holder will have got to. So, and that's a really nice way of approaching it, because also the potential sort of candidate and applicant can really sort of see, well, actually, I've got, I've already kind of know that I can move over fully into this role, or I'd need some training. But again, to your point, Bart, it kind of nicely gets over that rather than putting people off.
That's really, really interesting. One final question from our audience is that is this where external oversight can be very useful? So, for example, I guess if you happen to work with either an outside party, a recruiter, or someone who maybe doesn't have those vested interests and who has the clarity to see through that accretion and the various bits and pieces that go with it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can use, of course, a trustee, you could use a non-executive, you could use someone from a different department to ultimately have a discussion to arrive at those critical points, to really distill, again, I think that's the key word, what are the true sort of essential requirements. Again, anecdotally, we recently worked on a contract role. So as per standard, you get sent the job description, and that job description was for the permanent role. And actually what was wonderful in that scenario is we could be consultative, and the client really welcomed the dialogue. And we were actually sort of same time editing down the job description to actually what was the most important aspects, the critical aspects for that person to do in the maternity cover scenario. If we'd gone out with the original job description, it would really, again, have put off a lot of potential applicants, because you wouldn't have onboarded to all of those aspects by the time the contract was complete. So again, that's another good example of actually going through a process to distill what's absolutely critical.
I think but by the time we see job descriptions, it's very often in the mind of the employer too late to change them. And this is a real shame, because it's really quite common that we see things that could be formulated better. And this might be the point we're discussing about the sheer number of attributes. It can also be to do with language of equal opportunities and potential bias in the language and so on. Now, we're going next week. We're doing a webinar on job adverts, and we're going to suggest that adverts should be different from job descriptions. And what that means is there can be a little bit of time lag between sending the advert out and providing the job description. If a recruiter says to you during a briefing meeting, well, hold on a minute, you know, this isn't really manageable, all these attributes. If you can go take it back to the HR department and agree a redraft in the meantime. I know that's difficult in some circumstances. It's just unrealistic because the processes are just too bureaucratic or whatever. But if that, I'm absolutely convinced employers could, in general, improve their recruitment, their selection processes by taking advice like this. Yeah.
Yeah,
brilliant.
so.
Well, thank you both very much for that. I think that really sets a good set of guidelines to how to approach the process and how to think about the process. So let's extend this a little bit further, and let's explore the next topic for the webinar, which is all about the purpose of the role of the job description.
Candidates. So our next piece of advice is to make the purpose of the role explicit. So this is actually a very simple piece of advice, but one that's very often not done. So what often happens is employers give prospective candidates all kinds of information about the job without actually telling them why the job exists, and they leave the job seeker or the candidate to try and infer what the purpose of the job is from having read the job title and all the responsibilities and the skills and so on. It helps everybody in the process if you nail what the job is for. Why does it exist? What's the purpose? And one way of getting to that is when you're writing a JD is to ask yourself, why do we have this job? Or even better, what would go wrong if we didn't have anyone doing such a job? So to help you access the answers, think about the benefits. How does this role help you? What are the benefits that accrue to you as an employer? If you provide this, it will help candidates in two ways. First of all, that they will write better applications if they decide to apply, because they will just get it. They'll say, I see what they're driving at. I understand what they need. So they will tend to write applications better as a result. They will also probably make better decisions about whether to apply or not. You know, they'll listen to the purpose and think, yep, I'm the person who can do that, or well, that's why they need someone. Maybe that's not for me. And that really helps you as well if you're just getting more genuine candidates through the applications.
Brilliant. Thank you again very much indeed for that insight. And thanks again to our audience for asking some questions. So let's dive in with one of the first ones that we've been asked, is that, well, what's the best form of words to use when you're trying to articulate what the purpose of the role is? Is there a best form, and if so, what is it?
Shall I take that one first, Fiona? Since my job is communications and includes a lot of editorial, it's the kind of thing I'm interested in. Keep it incredibly simple. Do the obvious thing, which is the thing that people don't do. So say something like, the purpose of this job is, or this job is designed to ensure that. And if you begin the sentences, begin the thing with one of those sentences, especially the first one, the purpose of this job is, you can't kind of finish the sentence by just doing what most people do, which is just giving you a description of all the responsibilities. You have to think, yeah, what's it for exactly? What was it we want them to achieve? So, and my test here is, because I said in that pre-recorded segment, people often kind of think that they've told you what the purpose is, and it's there if you read between the lines, maybe you can infer it. my test is, can you point to it? Like if you say, yeah, I've explained the purpose. Okay, point to the sentence. What's the sentence that tells you the purpose?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I would build on that a bit further I would build on that a bit further by the fact that a job description is often a very static document, which is just we looked at very quick, sort of, if it's a replacement role, looked at incredibly quickly with a couple more things stuck on. And there's actually an inherent laziness. You can see that when we've worked with clients for years on repeat, where actually some of the job descriptions are now up to 7 or 8 pages, with no exaggeration. And all of the evidence and research shows that candidates can be really put off if they don't really understand the context and the purpose for the role. So the job description should not just be a list of encyclopedically of all the tasks that are associated with the job. It should be to describe the purpose of the role, but also how that role interconnects perhaps with the wider department, the objectives for that department, and how that relates overall to the direction of travel for the organisation. And that storytelling piece is super important to the continued engagement and sort of traction from the initial interest of a candidate into an application. And it makes the document work much harder on behalf of an employer.
Yeah, I attended a professional training event on diversity and inclusion, and they cited some research that suggested that when you have these kind of long lists of attributes, as we discussed in point 1, without a sort of distilling sentence as we're discussing now, the suggestion was that women are put off by that more than men. So the suggestion was that if women find 1 or 2 things, they think, "Oh, I can't do that," then they're put off applying, and perhaps there's a bit more bravado or whatever it is, I don't know what you would call it, and men are more prepared to say, "Well, yeah, I can't do that bit, but I can do all the rest." Now, I don't know whether that's true. I think when I heard it, I reflected on my own experience of working with people, and I think there probably is something in that, actually. So that's in terms of you particularly don't want to put off a certain kind of potential candidate by not telling them, whereas if you just say, look, the purpose is this, then the candidate's more likely. It's like in psychology, it's called a gestalt. It's like a light bulb moment where you say, "Oh, I get it. All right, I see what you want now. Yeah, I can do that."
Right. And this is really interesting, because what I'm hearing from the things that you're saying is that there's actually a multitude of benefits to be had from this. I mean, it's not just communication to a prospective bunch of candidates, is it? There's something deeper going on here. So what other benefits can you see that can come out of this process?
I think if it's approached well, the journey for the candidate is a lot more cohesive and consistent throughout the whole process. So the benefit to the employer is that they will reduce the amount of candidates who disengage. So, for example, if an employer is advertising the role directly, they might write or compose an advert that is very attractive, but when the potential applicant downloads the job description, if they then see a list of up to 40 attributes, a lot will be put off by that. And also, if they can't actually imagine the impact of the role or the context for the role, again, a lot of people will be put off by that. What we hear a lot as a recruitment partner is often a language from candidates in terms of, I'm a lot more interested now in the role. Now you've described its purpose and its context to us. I wouldn't have applied if we hadn't had this conversation. So I think that sort of qualitative evidence goes to show that there's a real gap at the moment going on in terms of how employers directly approach the market and how they can put off potential candidates from a range of backgrounds from applying.
It seems to me what you want is 2 things. You want candidates to intelligently self-select, so if they're not the right people for the job, they don't apply.
Absolutely.
So actually this clarity helps with that. And then the people who are the right people, you want them to write the best possible application, and giving them this key
absolutely
purpose helps. I'll add one other thing, which is it's really good to have an internal conversation about this, because actually you'll typically find that different people in the organisation have a different view of what the purpose of a job is. Now, if that is unresolved when you're in the selection process, that's going to lead to a kind of rather messy process. But in any case, quite apart from selection of candidates, isn't it just good as an organisation for everyone to be agreed what this person's trying to achieve in the end? So actually it's a really good sort of organisational development thing to ask.
And it sounds like it's another strand on that may well be that if indeed we're talking about the scenario that you outlined earlier on, where you've had an established person maybe leave and there's been a certain accretion to that role, maybe that's the only time that accretion gets recognised. And that surely identifies opportunities and also dangers, because there may not be necessarily the realisation that those roles are actually happening. And then there's suddenly this potential for this vacuum where those tasks don't happen. And so surely this should become some part of good practice.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think it's, again, trying to get that cohesion across sort of talent per se is obviously a very difficult thing to do. But one of the sort of brain movements is perhaps to think about how you would answer the question from a potential candidate around, what does good look like at the end of 6 months? How are you going to measure my success at the end of 6 months? What does good look like at the end of 1 year? And that lens can lead itself to you, again, being able to distill what are the really critical aspects of how you're going to judge success factors in the role, which then can bend back to a better sort of job description or a better writing of a composition of a job advert as well. And again, it just means that there is cohesion across the whole journey. And to Anthony's point, sort of greater clarity within the wider organisation around what the purpose of that role is really about.
Yeah, interesting. Well, one final question that we've had from our audience on this is, well, don't employers do this anyway? What in your experience? What would you say to that?
No.
I think
no.
If you use my pointing test, like can you point to the sentence that tells you the purpose? I don't have any hesitation in saying in the majority of job descriptions that I've read.
Majority.
No.
Interesting. Well, thank you both again for some really keen insights into that topic. And let's, in that case, move to the final topic, which is all around benchmarking. So let's see what Fiona and Anthony have to say around benchmarking.
When it comes to benchmarking, we often see a very demanding list of requirements, and that often is out of kilter with the remuneration and benefits package. So our advice here to employers when is around benchmarking is to analyse a range of sources. It's quite straightforward in the technology age to analyse any current or recent job adverts for a similar role. And indeed, job descriptions are often in the public domain for those roles, which again can be analysed to ascertain if they are comparative and if so, the type of salary that is being offered. One can also look at salary surveys, industry reports, and as mentioned before, job boards to actually achieve those valuable insights. So the key message here is to use multiple sources to amass evidence for a reliable, competitive salary range. And factors that really can impact salary, of course, are the actual ready supply of candidates for the role that you are seeking to fill, the appropriate level of salary for the experience that you actually do need for the role, and actually any comparative costs that the employee will need to bear in a different marketplace post the COVID pandemic, such as the costs that are involved for hybrid working versus those that are not involved if one is working from home, So the message in summary, is to look at a whole range of different sources to ensure that the range of salary that you're offering is in kilter with the candidate supply.
Yes, it's worth adding that when I'm working on job descriptions, job advertisements, I often kind of play a game, which is to read the description of what the employer is looking for first. And then, before I look at the figures, try to guess what the remuneration package is on offer. And nearly always what I find is the employer is offering less than I was expecting them to be offering. And incidentally, it hardly ever works the other way around. It hardly ever, I look at the package and think, oh, that's generous. I wasn't expecting them to offer that much. I think one of the problems is people are often a bit in denial about inflation and try and sort of, when they're putting together a package to offer, try and sort of pretend there hasn't been quite as much inflation as there really has, whereas the employee will be aware of inflation, will be aware that their living costs have risen. One thing you can do is use that game with someone else. Ask someone who's not involved in the process, someone who's not a budget holder, who doesn't stand to lose from offering a higher package, and just say, look, here, could you look at this JD, please? And could you just tell me what kind of figure are you expecting to see at the bottom there?
Brilliant. Again, thank you both for some really solid insights there. Thanks again to our audience for asking some questions. And the first, and in my mind, one of the most keenest questions that's come up is, why does this happen? I mean, there's got to be surely a recognition from the employer of the worth of the employee and the worth of the role. So where does this disconnect originate from?
Well, I think from our perspective, what we often hear is the word benchmarking, but it's purely down to an internal context. So it's all how that level of role interacts with other levels of roles in hierarchy within an organisation, be that sort of a small or sort of mid or larger size client. And the challenge with that has multiple impacts on recruitment, because it's around supply and demand of candidates in the open market, and it's also where that salary range is. So whilst it's idealistic to write a wish list of what you want that post holder to do, but no one has a magic wand to conjure up a marketplace of candidates if the salary is out of kilter. So for example, there are roles that are what we call commodity-based roles. So an example of that would be a financial controller, for example, which the market readily understands. But if what you are expecting in caliber is associated with the third sector range, of which starts at, let's say, sort of 85 to 100, and you're offering 70, there needs to be some calibration actually of what you're looking for. And to go back to some earlier points made, is perhaps distilling it again in terms of the essential attributes and looking at what training and development opportunities, Bart, to your point, can be offered to bring that person through. But it's naive to expect that you're going to be successful in that scenario.
Yeah,
interesting.
I mean, when you ask why does this happen, or the audience asks why does it happen, I mean, I'll just say I mentioned inflation in that recorded segment, and so I think that's a big cause of problems. So one of the things is some people try and buck the market in terms of, like, they kind of deny it's really there, and they say, oh well, we've always offered such and such for it. So it's like trying to hope that the candidate hasn't noticed that inflation has happened. Well, that's clearly, but usually it happens in a more subtle way. So I'll give you an example. Maybe they have done some benchmarking and they have seen other offers, or they've even used benchmarking data. You can get some from sort of Reed Employment, for instance, free of charge. It's very useful stuff. But of course, that's always historic. And so when was it last updated? Because it may be you're 6 months to a year out of date with the benchmarking data. A similar thing is they might have offered a job before. So what we often, as an agency, we get people who have tried advertising the job themselves and they didn't find anyone, and then they eventually think, oh, we better get an agency to do it. Well, there's a time lag there. And incidentally, the reason you didn't find something for the job was not because you were offering too much money, right? And so if there is a time lag, you think, well, actually things have moved on. Wages have gone up a little bit. So I think often people are not really fully accounting for inflation. There is also the question, this is a much more difficult thing to measure, but there is the question of inflationary expectations, because everyone knows there's been inflation. If they expect it to continue, I know Mr. Sunak doesn't expect it to continue, but then they're also thinking ahead, like, well, if I take this job for 50 grand now, well, what's that going to look like next year? So, and of course, then the question of pay review date becomes very, very important as well. I think there's another issue to do with bucking the market, and I've never discussed this with Fiona, so I'd be interested to know whether Fiona sees it the same way. Some of the organisations, quite a few of the organisations we work with, are technically not-for-profit third sector organisations, and often there's a mentality there that they are worthy organisations. We are worthy especially if they're charities, right? We're worthy, and therefore, people should want to work for us because we're doing some good, and therefore there's often an assumption that perhaps they won't want the premium dollar. Now, actually, I think that does actually happen sometimes, but only a certain number of your potential candidates will think that way. They won't all think that way. And even the ones who do genuinely appreciate the worthiness of an organisation still have to pay energy bills and grocery bills and so on. So, Fiona, I've never discussed that with you. I don't know if you see that kind of worthy mentality, or am I inventing that?
I think it's a really good point. We often hear the default position and argument of we do have charitable status, the emphasis on the values. But I think what's really interesting is when those same employers are actually out of kilter with other employers who also have charitable status. So the argument is a little bit flawed. Yes, in that situation. And actually, again, if they're looking for certain types of roles within the organisation and also wanting to encourage, for example, some more sort of difference in thinking, they may well also be wanting to attract people from outside of that sort of direct world. And so the argument, again, becomes quite flimsy in that situation where the drivers for that candidate may be far more around, again, what the role will give them in terms of career development, extension, sector exposure, etc. So I think all those points are well made. The only other one I would add is in sort of the birth of sort of hybrid working in the sort of post-COVID era, what we have found, and I know Anthony's very attuned to this, is that the majority of our candidates are now very exacting when it comes to the contractual detail. And on that inflationary level, travel is often rising at a level above the standard inflation rate. So where employers, for example, are saying we kind of want to, broadly speaking, do kind of 3 days in the office or 2 days, but it might be more, and the salary has remained static, that's where, again, candidates are getting disengaged with the process because they know their travel bill is going to go up probably sometimes by double digits.
Good grief.
So it's a whole bunch. It's a whole bunch of factors that come into. We talk about benchmarking from an employer's perspective, but candidates are also benchmarking the roles across a range of dimensions.
I don't want to take us off on a tangent in a big way, but something Fiona said I just comment on. I don't usually attend the briefing meetings from employers. Fiona attends most of those, and she's very experienced in that. But what I've noticed is when we try and pin people down, so the advertisement says something like hybrid working 3 days a week in the office, say, you try and pin people down and say, you're certain about that? Because actually candidates will want to know. It's very high on their list. Are you certain about it? What you often get is a bit of shuffling the feet. With it. And sometimes you find disagreements, like the line manager's perfectly happy 3 days a week because they don't want to be in more than 3 days a week. And maybe the managing director or the chief executive has a different view on that. That's quite common. So I think all I want to say there there is you have to kind of get your ducks in a row. So it's like complete clarity. What exactly is the offer? No equivocation.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, interesting, brilliant. Thank you again for a really interesting discussion around that point. I think there's a lot of, you draw out and teased out a lot of very salient issues there, and I think they're very, very relevant, and hopefully our audience has really engaged with that. So it remains for me to just ask one more thing, really. We've covered all the segments for this topic. I'd like to ask you a little bit about what FJ Wilson Talent Services does. I'm aware that you provide services to employers and also to individuals. So how do you assist job seekers in particular, please?
How do we assist job seekers as in candidates? Candidates,
Absolutely.
we have sort of a range of resources. So if you look at fjwilson.com, our website, there are a whole lot of links, such as downloadable PDFs. There are links to on-demand webinars. There's a link to our podcast, which has a wealth of episodes, both designed for our employers as well as job seekers. With regards to job seekers, we also offer presentation coaching and one-to-one executive coaching. So we try and have a range of resources, whether it's FAQs for contractors, but across a range of platforms to make it as accessible to as many people as possible.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed. So thank you very much indeed, Fiona and Anthony, for today's session. Thank you too for our audience for joining us today. I really hope you've enjoyed this session.
Thank you.
As Fiona has said, we hope that we'll see you on one of our future webinars. We've got another one next week, as Anthony said, all around job adverts. There's one other piece of thanks I'd like to add to this, and that's to a chap called Harry Chalmers, who's responsible for the various bits of music that we've used throughout this webinar. So thank you to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon. So bye-bye then.